So I thought this story was worth a follow-up because I think there's been an obvious break in the narrative. This time the bully-turned-victim story just isn't working. They tried it for a couple of days and no one was buying it, except for other left-wing journalists, of course. And the reason is simple. The now infamous Cathy Newman Jordan Peterson interview was a train wreck, and it was obvious to anyone that watched it. Newman was exposed as a one-trick pony. She basically employs a simplistic rhetorical device by misrepresenting the interviewee's position, a basic straw man, if you will, and if the interviewee doesn't correct that misrepresentation, then they have to some extent, consciously or not, bought into Newman's mischaracterization and end up defending positions that aren't theirs to begin with. And at that point, Newman wins because her ultimate aim is to discredit and smear her opponent. But Peterson steadfastly refused to play that game and spent a good portion of the interview clarifying what his actual positions were and backed them with evidence-based arguments, exposing Newman's position, as Douglas Murray put it, as nothing more than stances and not even especially intelligent ones. Now, I've noticed some people have tried to spin this as, well, Newman was just playing devil's advocate. Even Peterson alluded to this himself in a recent interview.
Well, you could say she played devil's advocate. I suppose that's one way of thinking about it.
But devil's advocate simply means taking the other side of the argument, whether you hold that position or not. It doesn't mean taking the other side of a straw man argument that you yourself constructed. This may seem like a minor point, but I think it's worth highlighting because to say Newman was just playing devil's advocate is to relieve her of her true motives, which again, as Douglas Murray said, is to expose her guest as a bigot. Peterson explains this after he made that reference to devil's advocate.
She laid out a set of ideological presuppositions, two sets actually, her set and my set. And the set of ideological presuppositions that she laid out for my side of the argument bore very little resemblance to anything that I think or say. Yeah. And so she would ask me a question, which wasn't really a question. It was a barb with bait on the end of it. Yeah. And I would respond, and then she would tell me...
So you're saying?
Yeah, she would say what I said, except then what she would say had nothing to do with what I'd saying. She was actually...
Quite little to
do. She was fabricating on the fly the person that she hoped, the villain that she hoped I would be, and then insisting that that was me and that denying it was a lie. Yeah. Essentially, that's what the interview was.
So it's deeply insincere because she was playing an ideological persona, and she wanted you to play one as well.
Well, she wanted me to be the proper foil for that, yeah. You know, and was insistent, is the right word, that I abide by that particular decision. Yeah.
Now, the day after I put out my initial video on this topic, Douglas Murray put out another piece in The Spectator titled, "It's Easy to Predict Where the Cathy Newman Backlash Will Lead," in which he notes two things have happened since the interview. One is that millions of people around the world have watched Newman's undisguisedly partisan interview. The other is that Channel 4 has tried to turn the tables by claiming victimhood. Any fair-minded observer might think that if there was any victim in this case, then it was Professor Peterson, who accepted an invitation to an interview in which he was then serially misrepresented. It was Peterson who, whenever he said anything, got the response, "So what you're saying is," followed by something that he had not said. And it was Peterson who, after he came off air, might have seen the contempt in which the Channel 4 news team as a whole held him by reading the tweet from the head of communications of Channel 4 News, Hayley Barlow, deriding this former Harvard professor as lobster guy. Anybody who regrets the anti-intellectualism of British public life should reflect on that tweet, which I see the head of communications at Channel 4 News has now deleted. Ah yes, the stunning and brave standing by their tweets. Murray goes on, anyone can predict where this piece of table turning will lead. It will be used next time someone wants to withdraw a platform from Peterson. It will allow him to be branded controversial professor. It will embed the idea that if you contradict certain ideas, you are in fact legitimizing and encouraging that most amorphous and convenient enemy of our time, hate. Meanwhile, Cathy Newman will avoid becoming controversial interviewer. Instead, she will become brave Cathy. Just one regrettable thing about which is that it will allow no opportunity for reflection on the editorial and journalistic disaster that was that interview. Now, thankfully, the Times wasn't buying the victimhood narrative. Melanie Phillips penned a piece titled "Defenders of Free Speech Have a New Prophet," A controversial Channel 4 interview highlighted how zealots want to crush rational thinking. Phillips recalls the incident in which Newman self-righteously asks, how could Peterson believe that his right to free speech trumped a transgendered person's right not to be offended? Because, he replied, in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. You are certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable. More power to you. At which gotcha point, she was rendered speechless. The encounter was a notable demonstration of rationality versus cognitive dissonance, of an open mind versus one that was sealed shut. It cast Channel 4's editorial standards in an extremely poor light. The station's response was to turn Newman into a victim. Her editor, Ben DePere, said such was the scale of the online threats and abuse she had received that he had called in security experts to carry out an analysis. The issue, however, is not Newman, but what she represents, the culturally dominant dogma that certain ideological beliefs are indisputably true. When the evidence shows they are wrong, it is therefore the evidence, not the beliefs, which must be knocked down. And here's Peterson's post-mortem on that particular exchange.
Her claims became so preposterous and so self-contradictory that it was difficult to remain completely detached. And I think, and this was the crux of the interview, and I think the part that's attracted the most attention, she had asked me at one point in a provocatively self-righteous manner just what gave me the right to assume that my privilege of free speech, let's put it that way, gave me the right to potentially offend someone and hurt their feelings.
Yeah.
And I thought about 6 things at the same time. But the first thing I thought was, you're a journalist. That's the last question in the world you should ever ask someone if you have any genuine integrity as a journalist, because that's all you have as a journalist. You have the right to offend people and hurt their feelings. And so I called her out on that. I said, look, you know, all you've done in the last 20 minutes is everything you possibly could to make me as uncomfortable as you possibly can. Yeah. And I said it in a way that I would say was designed to let her know that I knew exactly what she was doing. And then I suggested that that was actually okay because she had every right to do that, but that she couldn't have it both ways. She couldn't make her living and her reputation using those tactics, let's say. And those are, for her, those weren't tactics of seeking the truth. They were almost purely tactics of domination, yeah, right, and one-upmanship. Yeah. And maybe, you know, if you live in the postmodernist world, you don't believe in truth anyways. There's just victory and power games. And so perhaps that's what she was pursuing. I don't know exactly what she was pursuing. But it was so palpably obvious to the two of us at that point that she had, in fact, done nothing except try to make me uncomfortable, yeah, that calling her on it left her speechless. Yeah. And then that was the only time, I would say, when I actually spoke to the genuine human being instead of the ideological front.
Now I want to go back to the alleged victimization of Cathy Newman. A commenter on my last video left a link to this article titled, Cathy Newman's feminist fans aimed 30 times more violent sexist abuse at Peterson and his supporters than vice versa. Now, I actually have a minor quibble with the methodology used here, but it doesn't actually change the result, and at least they're transparent about it, and it's the best analysis anyone has performed on the alleged abuse. So basically, they performed a Twitter search for a number of violence-related keywords, which included the username @Cathy Newman. The search terms were slap, rape, smack, kill, hit, die, murder, punch, and the past tense of those words. They didn't search for terms like bitch because, as they state, the purpose of our research was to look for content directed at Peterson Newman that could necessitate police involvement. We did this because Newman claims to have called in the police. Quite simply, it's okay to call the police if someone threatens violence, whereas mere name-calling is not a threat and so not a police matter. Well, at least not yet. So after they'd done their analysis, they found a total of 2 tweets, retweets and likes of non-sexist and sexist violence aimed at Newman and her supporters, and a total of 63 aimed at Peterson and his supporters, and thus how the 30 times number is derived. My only quibble is that likes and retweets are counted as equivalent to the person that actually wrote it in the first place, but that doesn't change the outcome. The fact is there were more violent threats aimed at Peterson. Probably the best example was from feminist journalist Kate Bevan, who stated the following: "Standing ovation for Cathy Newman, who's interviewing an ocean-going dickhead on Channel 4 News and hasn't yet punched him." And if you had any doubts about her violent intentions, she commented on another tweet, "I would have punched him." So not only is the interview widely agreed to be a train wreck, the victim narrative has completely collapsed, except inside the echo chamber of leftist journalists. Let's hope we see more of that in 2018. I'll see you next time.